All right, we're diving into a really rich part of the Hebrew Bible today, Deuteronomy, chapters 9 through 11. Now, this can be a dense read, but we're going to be using a fantastic framework from Dr. Cynthia Parker that uses a few surprising tools to make it all click.
So let's be honest. How do you even begin to unlock a text that's 3,000 years old? It can feel pretty distant, maybe a little intimidating. But what's so cool is that the text itself actually gives us the keys we need to understand it.
And those keys are, well, they're a little unexpected. We're going to need a little bit of math. Yep, you heard me, math. Then some poetry, and finally a calendar. It might sound random, but stick with me, because it all comes together in a really powerful way.
Okay, let's start with our first tool, math. In chapter 9, Moses has to deal with a huge problem. The people of Israel have this really dangerous misunderstanding about why they're successful. They've got the formula for victory totally wrong.
So check this out. Here's the math the Israelites were doing in their heads. Our own goodness plus the wickedness of the nations we're about to face equals our victory. But Moses steps in and is like, nope, erase that. He says the correct formula is this: God's faithfulness to his promises plus the wickedness of the nations equals your victory. You see what he did? He completely removed their righteousness from the equation. It was never a factor to begin with.
So why is this math correction such a big deal? Because the wrong formula leads to this dangerous idea of imagined self-sufficiency. The second they start thinking they earned their success, they're on a fast track to arrogance, and they forget the real source of their strength.
And just in case they forgot, Moses gives them the ultimate reality check. He brings up their most embarrassing moment ever, the golden calf. He's basically saying, oh, you think you're so righteous? Remember that time I was up on the mountain and you were down below worshiping a gold statue? Yeah, it is definitely not your goodness that's getting you into this land. It's a humbling but absolutely crucial reminder.
So once Moses corrects their math and checks their ego, the text completely shifts gears. In chapter 10, we move from math to poetry. And this isn't just about pretty words, it's a powerful structure that gets to the very heart of why God gives all these laws in the first place.
It's a fair question, right? You can just imagine the people wondering, okay, so what's the point of all this? With this huge law code coming, what does God actually want from us?
And the text boils it all down to this one core idea. It's not just about following rules, it's about a relationship. A relationship defined by reverence, love, and serving with everything you've got. And to drive this home, the text uses this beautiful poetic structure to show us exactly what that looks like.
The poem kicks off with this huge cosmic picture of God. He owns the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. He's absolutely boundless and all-powerful. And yet, what does this infinitely majestic God do? He zooms in. The text says he sets his affection on this one small group of people, Israel. Out of everything he owns in the entire universe, he chooses them. So how do you respond to that? To being chosen by a cosmic God? Well, it's not an external thing. It's internal. Circumcise your heart. In other words, get rid of the hardness, the stubbornness, and become soft and responsive to God. That's the first part of this poetic parallel.
And now, watch this. The pattern repeats itself with different language. God is again described with these majestic, kingly titles from the ancient world, God of gods and Lord of lords. He's the ultimate authority, the boss of all bosses.
So, what does this supreme king do with all that power? Unlike human kings who might hoard it, God uses his authority to get justice for the most vulnerable people in society, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. And so the required human response? To imitate God. If the first response was internal, a changed heart, this one is external. You're supposed to take that changed heart and show love to the foreigner living among you, just as God does. The poetry makes it crystal clear. What happens on the inside should always lead to action on the outside.
Okay, on to our final tool, the calendar. And this one connects us to the very land itself. Chapter 11 gives us this stark contrast between two different farming realities, Egypt and the Promised Land, all to teach a huge lesson about reliance.
This text starts with this really strange phrase. It describes Egypt as a place where you water it with your foot. That sounds pretty odd, doesn't it?
What in the world could that possibly mean? I mean, you're not kicking buckets of water around. It's actually a reference to a specific and pretty fascinating irrigation technique.
Here's how it worked.
Farmers in Egypt would create a grid of plots right next to the super reliable Nile River. They'd fill trenches with water. Then to water one plot, they'd just kick down a small mud wall with their foot, and the water would flood in. To stop it, they just pushed the mud back. It was simple, predictable, and, here's the key, entirely human-controlled.
And this contrast is the whole point. The farming in Egypt, while easy, fosters that same dangerous self-sufficiency we talked about. But the Promised Land was completely different. It was a land of hills and valleys that relied entirely on the unpredictable rain from heaven. You couldn't control the water with your foot. You had to rely on God to provide it. The very geography was designed to teach dependence.
This deep connection to the land brings us to one last powerful idea: how physical places can be used to anchor our memories and make abstract promises feel real and tangible.
The idea is simple, but so profound. Place preserves memory. We've all felt this, right? You visit an old home or smell a certain scent, and it triggers a flood of memories. Well, Deuteronomy intentionally uses this very real human experience.
Think about this contrast. The original covenant was made at Mount Sinai, a place way out in the wilderness they would probably never see again. That memory could easily fade. So God commands them to renew that same covenant at two new mountains, Gerizim and Abel, right in the heart of their new home, along a main road. It wasn't about replacing Sinai, but about making that memory a constant, visible reminder in their everyday lives.
So whether it's correcting our math about success, understanding the heart behind the rules, or learning reliance from the land we live on, this ancient text is deeply concerned with how we remember who we are. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. What places in our own world, monuments, buildings, or maybe just a quiet street corner, act as physical reminders of who we are and what we value most?